The Prime Minister, Theresa May, says she'll consider whether to hold an inquiry into the contaminated blood scandal. Thousands of people were infected with hepatitis C and HIV through NHS blood products in the 1970s and 80s. The Prime Minister was asked by the Labour MP Diana Johnson to allow an inquiry similar to the investigation into the Hillsborough deaths.
Will the Prime Minister now look at setting up a similar review of the biggest treatment disaster in the history of the NHS, the contaminated blood scandal? Victims are still waiting for answers and justice 35 years on.
Theresa May says she's aware of the concerns.
I will take the point that she has made away and consider it. Obviously, as she will know, that the reasons and the background which led to the Hillsborough Independent Panel, but I recognise the concern that people have about contaminated blood and will consider the point that she's made.
Colette Wintle from Worcester developed cirrhosis of the liver following a transfusion with contaminated blood and has been campaigning for years about this. Is with me in our Worcester studio. Good afternoon.
Hello, good afternoon.
And how do you greet this news?
Well, clearly we would welcome any opportunity to examine what the lead-up and cause of the worst treatment disaster in the history of the NHS. That was a phrase coined by Lord Robert Winston when he was referring to the infection of multiple viruses through imported US blood to the haemophilia community, if I could just make that clear. I'm aware that people have been infected with Hep C through blood transfusion. What I'm talking about here is blood derivatives that have been pooled, which is what plasma is, to treat factor VIII deficiency, which came from America very specifically. And that historical story is particular to the haemophilia community, and chronologically the history of it began in the very early 70s when the importation of blood products began because we had failed to become self-sufficient in blood products.
And that therefore led to what has happened with yourself and,
yes,
and many thousands of others, I guess. So you welcome this, though?
Of course I welcome it, because actually there are an awful lot of questions which government have never answered, and they have been invited to take part in an independent inquiry but refused. People crawled from one end of the country to the other, seriously ill, to take part in that inquiry, and the Department of Health wouldn't even cross the road, which, was noted and didn't do them any favours.
So why is it so important that you get the answers to these questions?
Because I don't believe, unless you look back at something as tragic and dreadful as this, and catastrophic in the amount of deaths it's caused, unless you look back and examine what went wrong and why it went wrong, you cannot prevent something like this from happening in the future. I mean, many of the questions that we've asked over the years, for example, why were factor concentrates introduced before a method was developed to eliminate hepatitis? That knowledge was there. The state of knowledge by the mid-70s, which is when I was first infected, was that a 100% infection risk with imported products was likely. And I don't understand why we allowed a licence for products such as these when they were causing havoc in America, and we were being warned about it. The doctors were alert to it, but did nothing.
So those answers to those questions from 40 years ago are clearly what you are pushing for. But one thing you hinted at there is that you're not entirely certain that it couldn't happen again. Is that something that you're concerned about? I
am concerned because, unfortunately, a company which was under British ownership until 2012, when I'm afraid Jeremy Hunt allowed it to be sold to a venture capitalist in America, but it was a way of us controlling our supply and its efficacy and safety. We don't have that same protection now, and that's what concerns me. I mean, given what's happened to the haemophilia community particularly, and how many infections they've been exposed to through blood, it just shows you how dangerous the possibilities are. Now,
what is it that you ultimately want from the government? Is it a recognition? Is it some sort of discussion? Is it liability? Is it compensation? What is it?
I want a full examination of what went wrong and who made the decisions that brought about this disaster. Many of them are still around. Certainly there's plenty of doctors around who have the answers and know what went wrong, and have never been brought to book. And that is, for me, a vital thing. We had an apology from the Prime Minister 18 months ago, but words are ineffectual if you don't don't act on them. He acknowledged that he was apologising for something that shouldn't have happened. But since that point, not one single penny has gone to the pockets of the victims. Their losses have never been acknowledged.
And that's what you want. I mean, what kind of money would you consider a worthy payout to repair, at least attempt to repair some of the damage that this has caused?
I think we were letting them off the hook by even suggesting to them that if they'd actually upheld the findings of Lord Archer's independent report and his very, very well-measured suggestions and recommendations, then we would have been happy with that. Something on comparable with Ireland, where they didn't admit liability, but they acknowledged loss and suffering and pain, and that we have never had.
OK, Colette, thank you. Colette Wintle, who developed cirrhosis of the liver following transfusion with contaminated blood. She's from Worcester. She welcomes what Theresa May says. The Prime Minister saying she'll consider whether to hold an inquiry into the contaminated blood scandal. I dare say more on this as it develops.
20 to 8, BBC Hereford and Worcester. And this is a story that we've visited this several times, but a bit of a development on this morning. This is... Again, something else that the government are proposing to do. They're considering whether to hold an inquiry into the contaminated blood scandal. If you remember, thousands of people infected with hepatitis C and HIV through NHS blood products in the 70s and 80s. Theresa May was asked by the Labour MP Diana Johnson to allow an inquiry similar to the investigation into the Hillsborough deaths.
Will the Prime Minister now look at setting up a similar review of the biggest treatment disaster in the history of the NHS, the contaminated blood scandal? Victims are still waiting for answers and justice 35 years on.
But the Prime Minister says she's aware of the concerns.
I will take the point that she has made away and consider it. Obviously, as she will know, that the reasons and the background which led to the Hillsborough Independent Panel, but I recognise the concern that people have about contaminated blood and will consider the point that she's made.
Colette Wintle from Worcester developed cirrhosis of the liver following a transfusion with this contaminated blood, and has been protesting for years about the scandal. And she's with me in the studio now. Morning again, Colette.
Good morning, Elliott.
So is this welcome news, first of all?
Well, it's always welcome when government agree to engage on something as serious as this. So naturally, those of us who have been victims of the worst treatment disaster in the history of the NHS, are glad that it's being acknowledged. Certainly, we're very grateful to a stalwart supporter, Diana Johnson. She's, been fantastic in support of this for some years. And it's interesting that her party in the last year have actually changed their narrative on the blood contamination from an unavoidable accident to negligence of public bodies. So there's clearly, a case here to examine and look at, and answers that have never been given to people like myself who have been campaigning for years for the truth. So clearly, yes, we do welcome this.
Now, obviously, I said in the introduction, we've spoken many times, we've talked about this story a few times. If people haven't, if this is the first time they're hearing it, remind us, you had a transfusion with contaminated blood products, and what's changed in your life? What's your life been like since?
First of all, if I could just clarify that it wasn't a whole blood transfusion, it was blood derivatives, plasma products, which were being manufactured and made in America and were being taken from the worst possible sources. We're talking about prison blood from alcoholics and people that had an interest in earning money for their blood. So it wasn't whole blood transfusion, and that there is a difference between what happened to the haemophilia community over 30 years of treatment as opposed to a window within the transfusion service in the UK where blood was not actually heat treated. Therefore, there was a period of time where some people got whole blood transfusion.
So how has it affected you?
Well, from the outset, obviously, it's from the age of 17, my life has been health-wise been destroyed by it to the point where I've reached cirrhosis of the liver. It has meant that I have lost out on career. I've suffered financial loss due to that, not been able to contribute to, my family life. And I've lost out on a lot of time with my family, not being able to do the normal things that people expect to be able to do because I've been so ill with these hepatitis viruses. And obviously having the condition of cirrhosis is very serious because you're at high risk of developing cancer. So I am being tested every 6 months now for the emergence of cancer.
So are you hopeful that we'll finally get an inquiry into this?
Well, I think that the Prime Minister has a moral responsibility, and I would like to think, since by reputation she seems to be somebody that likes to get jobs done properly, that I'm hoping she'll do what no other Prime Minister has done, and that is properly engage, because there have been half-hearted attempts at this over the years by setting up, what we refer to as begging bowl systems, which are humiliating, degrading and divisive and derisory, considering the level of damage that's been done to people with these diseases. They're very, very serious, and a proper examination of what went wrong and a proper level of compensation is what is due and long overdue. So I hope that Theresa May is serious about taking a look at this and will in fact offer the opportunity to answer that charge of negligence by public bodies.
Well, we'll wait and see. We'll watch very closely. No doubt we will speak again on this subject.
No doubt we will.
Colette, lovely to see you again. Colette Wintle there from Worcester, who developed cirrhosis of the liver.